The question is, how do you differentiate the utility of behavioral psychotherapeutic treatment for a condition like depression versus medical treatments? Okay, so the first thing I would say is, don't underestimate the utility of medical interventions. Depression is a catastrophe. It carries with it a very high suicide rate, and it also levels people out, and it's really hard on their families, and it is psychologically extraordinarily damaging. And so if you're in a depressive state and it's severe, you can try an antidepressant. You will know in a month if it works. If it works, well, maybe it will help you get your life together. We could say, well, maybe you're depressed because your life isn't very well together. Could be. Sometimes people are depressed. Their life is just, it's not fine because no one's life is fine. Everyone's life is a tragedy, but sometimes people have their lives in order as much as you could express anyone to have. They have friends, they have an intimate relationship, they have a career that they like, they are qualified. Industrious people working hard on what they're doing and really playing a minimum number of games with themselves. And they're terribly depressed. Antidepressant man sometimes that will just fix it. And so hooray, you're a biological entity. If there is something out there that can help you to strengthen yourself so that you can prevail, great. And people, you hear everyone takes antidepressant, everyone's taking them. It's like no one takes those bloody things without serious consideration. Half the time I spend with my clients who are depressed is often the 2 years long attempt to get them to try an antidepressant because they're so guilty that they rely on an external crunch to sort out their lives and they cannot even tolerate. But I say, well, look man, what if you had diabetes? You're not gonna take your insulin. It's like you got stressed. You blow out your weakest point. That's what happens when you get stressed. If there is something out there that might help you, it's like try it for God's sake. You will know in a month and you just stop if it doesn't work now. Having said that, you want to do multi-dimensional analysis. It's like, well, do you have any friends? Do you have any intimate relationship? Or are you pursuing any friends? Do you have any intimate relationship? Do you have a reasonable career? Are you as educated as you are intelligent? Do you have something useful to do with your time outside of work? Do you have a drug or alcohol problem? Are there other behavioral issues like sleep dysregulation and lack of eating that are contributing to the pathology? You want to differentiate all of that, and whatever you can make a behavioral intervention, so much the better. Whatever you can make a behavioral intervention, so much the better. But sometimes too, you're dealing with people whose lives are so wrecked that they don't even know where to start. They differentiate then to those who have everything in order, say, and you say, well, try this, man. Maybe you won't cut your throat in the next month because if you're dead, it's gonna be hard to work with you. So medical interventions, anything. If you're sick, you do what's necessary to get better. And you have your pride behind if you have to. And that says nothing about the utility of the behavioral interventions. You want to hit the problem with everything you have at your disposal. But some antidepressant, especially for people whose lives are together and who are depressed, antidepressant can absolutely miraculous. So when you hear about a clinical evidence in their favor being iffy, and that's pretty because the diagnosis of depression isn't very well formulated. It's very difficult to have a terrible life than to be depressed. And antidepressants can only help you so much if you have a terrible life. You want to stay inside this little map because it's working. You want to get from point A to point B, and this is good. This indicates that you are moving forward. That's the first thing it indicates. And the second thing it indicates, which is even more important, and you will never hear this from behavioral psychologists, is that your map is correct. So every time you move a little bit forward and something that you want happens, it says, oh, the game I'm playing is the right game. And so not only does the reward indicate progress, it indicates that the frame with which progress is being calculated is the right frame. And that's good because it's a frame that makes things irrelevant and you want them to stay irrelevant. So if you don't move forward and you start to question the frame, that's why worse than merely not moving forward. You get a bad exam grade. What do you think? What the hell am I doing in the university anyway? It's like, probably that's not the first place you should go with that piece of information. And you think, well, why? Why is that worse? Well, as far as I can tell, your map of you as a university student is comprehensive representation. It tells you what you should do every day. It tells you where you're gonna be in the future. And if something emerges as an annually, you get worse grade than you expected, and you blow that whole map, it's like, okay, where have you been doing for the last 4 years? What high school mindful students were you? How clueless as you about how are you arranging your future? What's your identity gonna be if you're not gonna be a student? Where are you gonna end up in the 5 years? So it's like that little grate, the bad grate. It's like the portal through which snakes can crawl. And that's exactly how you respond to it, especially if you open the door too much. Well, maybe this means that I shouldn't be in university. Well, one of the rules is don't. You want to constrain the anomalous event to the minimal necessary domain. It's really important. You want to do that when you're arguing with your partner, which will be all the time. We have an argument, well, I should never have married you. It's like, no, that's not the first response. That's the bad response, or here is really good ones. You've always doing that. You've always done that thing, and you always will. It's like, oh, good, great. It's like the only answer is to hit someone because you're done, right? You're like that. You've always been like that. There isn't a chance that you can be repaired, and none of it is acceptable. It's like the person is gonna fight with you right away, because what else are you gonna do? So what you want to do is you want to minimize. It isn't rational realization. You want to say, okay, the person did something that disrupted our joint map. Okay, what's the smallest possible thing they could do to put it back together? And you have to know, well, we need to make a plan and you don't do it again. Or we need to have a discussion so that we know that it wasn't a good thing to do. But I'm not gonna go after the whole character. I'm gonna say, when I come home and we're watching TV, you just come to the door and say hello, not don't love me, or sometimes like that. It's like, no, you just have to walk to the door and give me a hug, or sometimes, and then that's good enough. And so then the other person might be able to tolerate that much corrective information, maybe, if you're nice about it, and you also understand that they're probably gonna have some equally horrible to say about you in the next 15 minutes because you're gonna do something stupid. So you don't want to open the door so every possible snake comes crawling through, because that's pathway to depression. And you actually see that's happening in depressed people, is every small event produces a cascade through their entire value system, and they end up saying, well, there's just another person that I should jump off a bridge, and they really see it that way. It's really awful because they've got no defense. It's like, well, I didn't do so well in the course. It's like, I'm gonna get a bad mark on the exam. I'm gonna get a bad mark on the course. That's gonna screw up my ability to finish my degree. I'm never gonna get into the field of my choice. It is just another piece of indication that I'm useless and that life is worthwhile. It is not worthwhile. Bang! I'm going to jump off the bridge. And if you're really depressed, it's like each of those things hits you with the certainty of truth. It's really not good. And so you want to be careful. You want to be careful enough walking down that pathway. When you make a mistake, you think, okay, what's the narrowest framework of interpretation within which I can understand thing that I will repair minimal behavioral change to decrease the probability that it will happen again. It's mental hygiene, fundamentally. That's the next question. It's because they do not exist in isolation. So that's another thing. Frequently when you have behavioral account of cognitive process, they generally only focus on as if it's an isolated thing. It's not. It's scalable. It's scalable a bunch of ways. It's scalable temporarily because what you do now is associated with what you will do tomorrow, and that with what you will do next week, and so forth. So it has to be scalable temporary and also scalable socially. So it has an effect on you, that has an effect on your family, that has an effect on the community, and so you do not want to take. It's very difficult to think through the effect of your action on all those scaling level simultaneously, but you have mechanisms that allow you to do that, and we will see. I think that the sense. Let's assume that you're not lying to yourself constantly. So you hit, it's in full of chaos and garbage, and you have reasonable relationship with people in the world. I think that this is leaping way ahead. I think that your sense of meaningful engagement with what you're doing is the psychological marker that you're acting in a way that takes all you stacked responsibilities into account simultaneously. Because you're trying to figure out where you are, and you might think, well, that means where am I in this room? But look, this room is not thing. It's nested. It's subset of the university. It's subset of society. It's subset of your life. The room is a complicated thing, and you need to figure out where you should be in the room. And you cannot do that surely with perception, because all you see is me and some of the wall, right? You've got this little narrow portal, and so you cannot really rely on your perceptions to orient you, but you do orient yourself. And I think what you do is it is engagement. It's like, does this seem meaningful and deep and engaging? Yes, that's indication that's serving multiple masters simultaneously, so both socially and also temporally. And so I think the sense of meaning is actually an instinct that orients people in time and space. It is the most fundamental form of perception, and that's the only optimistic thought that I ever been able to derive from psychology, is that actually could be true. It could be that the sense of meaning is an orienting reflex, and that would be wonderful if it was true, because it would make it real, and it's one of the devastating elements of nihilism is something like, well, who the hell cares? What are you doing? What difference is it's gonna make in a million years? It's like your sense of meaning is just an illusion, You're a limited creature in a limited place, and nothing you do really matters. It's like that. It's a powerful argument, especially if you're an objective material and a reductionist. It's a killer argument, but it looks to me like it's wrong. It's actually wrong because meaning looks to me like it's an actual phenomena. It does say your position probably between chaos and order, something like that. It's a real so we will see. We're gonna develop that argument because it's real. You want to know that because it gives you something to stand on. Maybe it is as real as pain, but it is not pain. It's something positive, and you need something positive that you can only rely on. All right, so the psychoanalysis, I think, are too much on the side of the subject. They tend to think that you got too much of you inside of you and too little of you that's outside of you. And part of reason I believe that it's because of my clinical experience. I love the psychoanalysis, man. They're brilliant. They're deep. They grapple with real problem, like with problem when people have real problems, and I mean profound problems. They're really profound moral problems and problems of good and evil, really, There are things gonna in their family and are so terrible that, well, there are some things fatal and lie for decades and decades and decades. It's awful, and that's not exactly inside them. It's out there in the world, and lots of people that I see. Your famous critic of psychology, and I can't remember this name, but I probably will criticize the practice of psychology quite effectively in the belief, in the early 60s. The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Sazas. It's a classic. You should read it if you're interested in psychology. Read it like it's a classic. And he basically said most people have problems in living. They do not have psychological problems. So I've experienced, despite all of my love for psychoanalysis, very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends that people kind of like that? How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust that maybe has a future? That would be good. Sometimes that you trust and maybe has a future. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere? So at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself and schedule in a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that if you guys don't have a routine. I would recommend like you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time, get up whatever your time wants, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulated your circulation rhythm and they regulate your mood and eat something. It's in the morning. I've had lots of clients who had anxiety disorders. I had one client who was literally starving, very smart girl. There was a very little that she liked. She kind of tried to subsist, on like half a cup of rice a day. She came to me and said, I have no energy, I can't come home, all I want to do is watch the same movie over and over and over again. What like, it's like weird? And I thought, well, it depends on how hard you work, it's a little weird, but whatever, it's familiar, you're looking for comfort. So I did an analyze of her diet. It's like 3/4 of a cup of rice. It's like you're starving. It's something, you will feel better. So she modified her diet, and all her anxiety went away, and she had some energy. It's like, yeah, you gotta eat. So a schedule, that's a good thing, man. Your brain will think you're for it. It will stabilize your nervous system with a bit of a pain. That's a good thing. You need a career. You need something productive to do with your time. You need to regulate your use of drugs and alcohol, most particularly alcohol, because that does end a lot of people. You need a family like the family you have, your parent and all. That would be nice if you all got along. You could work on that. That's a good thing to work on. And then, you probably need children at some point. And that's life. That's what life is. And if you're missing, you may have a good reasons to not be opening on one of those dimensions. It's not mandatory, but I can't tell you that if you're not operating reasonably well on 4. I think I mentioned 6. If you're not operating reasonably well on the last 3 of them, there will be no way you're operating reasonably. You're gonna be psychologically thriving, and that's more pragmatic in some sense. That psychological, right? Human beings have a nature. There is a thing we need, and if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. So behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. It's practical. It's like strategizing, make a career plan, figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they say and what they want, and sometimes you can give it to them and maybe they will return the favor. And if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there is a 2 of them under most circumstances, and it's better to have 2 brains than 1, because people think differently because of their temperament mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises, and it's a part of transformation, the psychological transformation that attendant on the intimate relationship. And one of the fundamental purposes of long-term intimate relationships, so we're starting to be able to put the traits, to sort of nail the traits down, their underlying biology. With regard to neuroticism, well, if you're high in neuroticism, you're more sensitive to anxiety, and that's regulated at least in part by hippocampus and generated in the other part of the brain. There is another part of the brain called aqueduct gray that seems to be associated with experience of pain, and pain is quite a complex phenomena. Depression is pain, like grief is pain, like social isolation is pain, like disappointment is pain, like there is anxiety compounds to that too. And so neuroticism seems to be something like threshold for activation in those negative emotion systems. So if you're higher in neuroticism, and unit of uncertainty might produce, let's say, 3 units of psychological response, whereas if you're lower in neuroticism, 1 unit of uncertainty might produce 1 unit of psychological response. It's hard, obviously that simplified schemata, but there is variability because of something unexpected and threatening happening to you. It isn't obvious how upset you should get. One answer what might be brushed off, it's nothing. Another answer might be it's a bloody catastrophe. And often when something uncertain or threatening occurs, you don't have enough information at your disposal to make a full determination of the potential import of the circumstances, especially if it's not certain. And so then you have a guess at how upset you should be and where are you at the normal distribution. With regard to trait neuroticism, say, the sort of determines what your guess on average is gonna be. So, the other with conscientiousness. So, say you might say, well, how hard should you work? Well, that's really difficult question. If you're gonna die tomorrow, and then you probably shouldn't work very hard today at all. So one thing you might say is that the degree to which you should work hard is dependent on your assumptions about stability of the future. We actually know this to be true because if you put people in wildly uncertain circumstances, they discount the future, which is exactly what you should do. It only makes sense to store up goods for future consumption if the future is likely to be very similar to the past at the present. You need a stable society for that, and conscientiousness only works in a stable society, because all you do otherwise, if you're piling up goods, which is what conscientious people do, it's leaving them there for criminal to take or waiting for the next chaotic upheaval to wipe out everything that you're stored. And so even conscientiousness is a guess. Hard-working people say, well, sacrifice the present for the future. That's great, as long as the future is gonna be there and you can predict it. But if it's not gonna be there and it's unpredictable, then the right response to take what you can take right now, well, the getting is good. Now, obviously, there are troubles with that too, and I'm offering rough rules of thumb, but I'm trying to provide you with some indication of how and why these differences in value structure exist, because they're applicable in different environments. Sometimes in a dangerous society environment, it's not obvious that being an extroverted person is a good idea, because extroverted people, they stand out, especially if they're extroverted and creative, right? Because not only they noisy and dormant and assertive, they are also colorful and flamboyant and proactive. What happens to people in that, as they move toward zero, positive feedback loops get set up, so they're more likely to hit zero. And as they move away from zero, positive feedback loops get set up so that they are increasingly more likely to move away from zero. So here is an example. Let's say you're not doing too bad, so maybe you're in the middle of the normal distribution, then you lose your job. Okay, let's say you're a conscientious person, and we could say, just for the sake of argument, that you lose your job because of mass layoff in your company. So it has nothing to do with you. It's just lack of draw, basically. But then what happens to you? Well, if you're conscientious, you're gonna go after yourself pretty hard. So and especially if you're also high in neuroticism, it's gonna depress you to lose your job. And maybe you're in a situation where you just, for one reason or another, you don't have that many other opportunities. Now, maybe you should look for them. Maybe you're in a depressed state of the economy, or you're geographically located somewhere that make moving difficult, or so on and so forth. But you lose your job, and then you start to get depressed because of that. Well, then as you start to get depressed, it increases the probability that you're going to look for a job, but also maybe start to put stress on your family, and it's also start to decrease the probability that you're going to engage in positive social interaction. So now, not only are you unemployed and suffering from economic stress, but your marriage is starting to suffer, and you're starting to isolate yourself from your friends. And then, of course, as a marriage suffers and the stress builds up, and that's gonna make you more depressed, and that's gonna keep you even farther away from your friends, and that's gonna decrease the likelihood that you're gonna have enough positive emotion and enthusiasm to look for another. And then maybe you want to add a bit of drinking problem to just for fun. And you can see that you can get a spiral going that just taking you down, right? And it's all sort of things, because lots of time people conceptualize, let's say you're an unemployed guy and you go to consulting and you get a diagnosis of depression. And the thing about the diagnosis of depression is, like, the assumption is there is something going wrong with your psychological structure. It's like if you're unemployed and you're depressed, it isn't obvious at all that the problem is in your head. You know what I mean? It's not even obvious that it's a psychological problem. It's just a problem. A problem can take you out. And so if you're unemployed and you're under economic stress and your marriage is starting to shake and you're isolating yourself from your friends and you're less likely to be motivated to go to look for a job, you can think about that as a depressive spiral. But you can also think of it as a conspiracy in some senses of external forces that are arguing you into a ground. And we don't tend to conceptualize psychological disorders that way, but we should, because lots of times when people are suffering from something that you could describe in psychological terminology, and depression is a very good example of that, it isn't obvious that there is something wrong with psychologically. Often they just are in trouble, and there isn't a category in psychological diagnosis for client in serious troubles. But my experience has been almost without that. The people just come to see me because something gone wrong with their life, not because they have a psychological problem. No. Now, you could say, well, their psychological inadequacies, such as they might be, are interfering with their ability to recover, or maybe even served as a resources to increase the probability of the catastrophe. And so a well-functioning personality has all the micro routines in place. That's actually something that you help people with if you're a behavioral therapist, because one of the things you assume if you are in a behavioral therapist is that sometimes the reason people aren't doing things is because they do not know how. Sometimes maybe the person is depressed but potentially high functioning. They got all the damn micro routines. They're well socialized. They're just dominant. You gotta make them awake again and implementing them But sometimes you get someone in your practice, say, who's just been neglected like you cannot believe. Parent never paid any attention to them, or maybe just punished them every time they did something good. That's really fun, and then they didn't make friends, and so they're really, really vague and poorly articulated. And so then what you do is you work at the bottom of the micro routines and get them to practice building up all these little attributes that they didn't build up. And one of the things you can think about in terms of character development is, so now maybe you understand something about your own personality. You might say, well, what could you do to improve your personality? And the answer is develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people, and that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and get them doing nice things for the other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiation. And so you can place yourself on the personality trait distribution. You're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend more time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that outside of your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally and so forth. So you can, I think, partially what are you doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks that you were before. And I think you can practice that consciously. It's like you're hyper orderly and, well, get a dog. Dogs are messy, horrible things. Just what you need if you're hyper orderly, because they're gonna leave hair everywhere and you focus on to live with it. Okay, so that's this is you, right? This is your personality. It's this collection of subroutine that you've turned into a hierarchy, and then there is something at the top of it, and that's a big question. What the hell should be at the top of the hierarchy? Because that's ultimate question of unity. And the therapist would say, well, it's the self-actualized person, or it's the self, or something like that. And perhaps explicit ideas that you're aiming for. And you might say, well, does such thing exist? I would say, well, do you admire people? Because that's your answer. Do you despise people? Well, you like some people and you don't others. You respect some people, you don't respect others. While you're acting out the notion that there is at least an implicit ideal. You do the same thing when you go to movies. You know who the hero is. You know who the bad guy is. You're acting out the proposition that there is some value hierarchy and there are some manifestation of it that's coherent across time. So you appear to believe that, and you are driven, at least to some degree, by your own inner ideals. And so you tend to answer the question, is that real? With an affirmative. And if you don't, there is catastrophic consequences. Nietzsche was very good at detailing that. It's like, you let your value hierarchy, well, then what? Well, part of it's nihilistic chaos. It's not so much fine. And then there is alignment of nihilistic chaos with intrinsic desire that someone will come along and tell you what to do. So what happens if you let this devolve? You end up with nihilistic chaos or demand for the tyrant to come forward. And we've had that happen lots of the times. And it doesn't seem to have gone that well, right? Well, so what happened when you lay out those little routine in the world at different level of analysis? Well, this is how your emotions function. And broadly speaking, you're aiming at something. And this is an oversimplification, which is why I want to show you this, right? When I show you this, assume that it's made out of that, right? It's just schematic oversimplification, because even if, let's say, then I'm trying to do something as simple as walking toward the room. I mean, that of the action of walking towards the door is predicted on the existence of all the subroutines that enable me to propel my body across time and space, and that took a lot of internal organization to get the right. It's automized now, so you can treat it like it's invisible, but implicit in any way, and any one of these structures is that entire structure, and you actually see this in therapy very frequently too. And one of the things that I figured out over the last year is this is a good proposition, so it's pretty self-evident that life has got its redness of miseries, and that's for sure. Maybe you could even make a categorical statement that life is mostly a redness of misery. You can make a pretty powerful argument for that, but then there is a counter question, which is, well, what if you tried not to make it any more miserable than it had to be? Then what would it be like? And my suspicion is that a lot of that misery, I would suspect that most of that misery would go away because it's unnecessary misery that really brings you down. It's like, well, someone has cancer, it's like, that sucks, but it's not like you can say, if only we had won this differently, then that wouldn't have happened. But when someone out torturing you in a malevolent way, or maybe you're doing the same, you can always ask yourself, well, is this really necessary? Is this just like a useless add-on to miseries of life? Really necessary? That's what people, and so even in your own life, if you aren't suffering from self-imposed misery and you're only suffering from inescapable misery, maybe you could handle that and you could survive, you could hear it. And so the goal would be, well, yeah, life is a redness of miseries, and maybe it has no ultimate meaning. We could say that if we were feeling particularly pessimistic, but it still leaves one question open, which is, if you didn't do everything you could do to make it worse, how good could you make it be? And the least answer is, well, it could be tragedy, but maybe not hell. And I think that that's right. I really believe that that's most pessimistic proper statement. The worst case outcome in the worst of all possible worlds is that your life could be tragic, but not hell. And that's a lot better than that, right? And you think I could give you an example of the difference. You're at your mother's deathbed. Well, that's tragedy. Here's another scenario. You're at your mother's deathbed and you and all your idiot siblings are arguing. Well, that's the difference between tragedy and hell. And you might be able to tolerate the first circumstance, and maybe it would even bring you closer together with your family members. The second one, no one can bear it. You walk away from a situation like that, sick of yourself and sick of everybody else too. And this is often the case, that tragic circumstances bring out the dragons because the stress is high and all the things that people haven't dealt with, they don't have the energy to repress, and all bitterness comes pouring forward. It's like, seriously man? So that actually it's rough lesson, but it's a good hallmark of figuring out whether or not you've got yourself adjusted properly and in relationship to your siblings. It's like, if you all gather around the bed of someone close who's dying, could you manage it? If the answer is no, it's like, well, put your life together because it's gonna happen, and you should be the person who there that can do it and do it properly. And then maybe you would find isn't the thing that will determine your faith in life itself. And I've seen both of these situations, ugly situation, murderously ugly situation, and then their opposite, where people have a terrible thing happen to them as a family, and they put together and they rebuild their damn ship and they sail away, and so that seems to me to be a lot better. That makes you Noah when the flood comes, right? Well, okay, so same thing as the question emerges. Well, who are you? Well, you could say you're this plan. That's how people usually identify. Maybe they have no plan at all and they'll just in chaos, right? That's like being in belly of the beasts. They're nihilistic in chaos. They have no plan. They're just chaos itself. And that's a very dreadful situation for people to be in. Maybe they conjure together a plan. That's their identity. It's fragile and they're holding on that with everything they've got. It's their little stick of wood that they're floating in clinging to, and so they're identifying really hard with the plan. That's what happens when you're an idyllic, is that you're identifying really hard with that plan. The problem is something comes up to confront it. Well, how do you act? Well, you cannot let go for that plan because you drone, then you cling to it rigidly. Well, that's not good because then you cannot learn anything. Then if that's you're a totalitarian, you're not gonna learn anything. You're gonna end up in something that's close enough to hell so that you won't know the difference, and you might drag everywhere along with you. That it happens plenty of times, right? It's the whole story of the 20th century. It happens over and over and over, and it happens in people's states. It happens in their business organization. It happens in the cities. It happens in their provinces. It happens in their states, and it happens in their psyches all at the same time. You cannot blame the manifestation of the thing on any of these one's level. It happens when society goes down that way. It goes down everywhere at the same time. It's not the totalitarian at the top and all happy people striving to be free at the bottom. It's not that at all. It's totalitarianism at every single level of hierarchy, including the psychological. And so you do not want to be the thing. You don't want to be in chaos. That's for sure. But you don't want to be the thing that clings so desperately to the raft that you cannot let go. When someone comes to rescue you, right? You don't want to be in that. So then you think, well, exactly what are you? You're not the chaos. You're not the plan. Maybe you're the thing that confronts the obstacles. I would say that's the categorical lesson of psychology insofar as it has to be with personal transformation, because that's what you always teach people in psychotherapy. I don't care what psychotherapists you are. You're always teaching them the same thing. You're the thing that you're not planned. You're the thing that can confront the obstacle to the plant. And then when you know even further that the obstacle is not an obstacle, but opportunity itself, well, then your whole view of the world can change, because you might think, well, I've got this plan, something come up to object to it. It's possible that the thing that's objecting has something to teach you that will take you to the place where you develop an even better planet. It's a nice framework to use. It's like, are you so sure that this is a problem? Is that only way that you can look at it? Or is an opportunity? I mean, not trying to naively optimistic. There are some things that pretty hard to extract gold from some dragons, and maybe the death of the family member is a good example of that. But even in a situation like that, I can tell you that it's an opportunity for maturation. That's for sure. And the thing is, you might say, well, it's pretty miserable to be digging for gold when someone's falling into the grave. Well, if they really love you, first of all, that's what they will want you to do. And second, you're gonna make their death a lot more palatable experience for them if you're someone who can be in the room and be helpful instead of quivering in the corner and feeling that your entire world is collapsing in on you. I mean, that's another. You want to be the useful person at the funeral. How is that for good? That's a good goal, man. You know, you've got yourself together in a situation like, because you're gonna be at them, and maybe you want to be the person on whose shoulder people cry. That would be a good goal. I don't like being naive, relatively optimistic. So when I tell you to get your life together, I'm not gonna say rose and sunshine. It's like that a problem for fools, but it's really something to be the reliable person, you know, at the funeral. There is this idea he did in Jungian psychology called the circumambulation, and Jung had this idea that you had a potential future self, which would be in potential everything that you could be, and that it manifests itself moment to moment in your present life by making you interested in things. And the things that you're interested in are the things that would guide you along the path that would lead you to maximize development. Now, it sounds like metaphysical idea even, but it's not. It's really profoundly biological idea. The idea is something like, well, you're set up so that you're automatically interested in those things that would fully expand you as a well-adapted creature. Well, there is nothing radical about that idea. What else could possibly be the case unless there is something fundamentally flawed about you? That is what the situation would be. It is interesting to think about how that would be meaningful moment to moment, but the idea is something like, well, your interest is captured by those things that learn you down the path of development. Well, the better be the ease. Okay, so that's fine. And so there is some utility in pursuing your things that you're interested in. That's the call to adventure, let's say. And the call to adventure takes you all sorts of places. Now, the problem with the call to adventure is, what the hell do you know? You might be interested in things that are rapid and dense. And often it's the case that when new parts of the people manifest themselves and with their interests, say, they do it very badly and shouldly. And so you stumble around like an idiot when you try to do something new. That's why the fool is in predecessor to the saver from the symbolic perspective, because you have to be fool before you can be a master. And if you're not willing to be the fool, then you cannot be a master. So it's an error-ridden process, and that's also laid out in Old Testament stories, because the first thing that happens, all these practical figures, when God kicks them out of their father's house when they're like 84, is that they run into all sorts of trouble, and some of it's social and some of it's natural and some of it's consequence of their own moral inadequacy. So the rules, but the thing that's so interesting is that despite the fact that they're foolish, they're still supposed to go on an adventure, and they're capable of learning enough as a consequence of moving forward on the adventure, so that they straighten themselves out across time. And so it's something like this circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual. We'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life, when you go back across your experience, you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself, and there might be variation on that, like a musical theme, but it's like you're cycling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now remember that for a second, because you will go back to it, okay? So imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's driving, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea, and the proper response is that you're right. It's probably a stupid idea. It's probably that as you move forward on your adventure that you're gonna get it right the first time is zero. It's just not gonna happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40 years old, 13 years old, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for got it, until they finally get it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't gonna help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you, in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as a perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you ever heard of anything. Highly likely. Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked, because the thought of stupidity as being, you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're gonna do it badly, and that's really useful because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly, but the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's continual message that echoes through those historical stories in Genesis. It's like these are flawed people. They should have got the hell out of their house way before that. And they go out and they stumble around in tyranny and famine and self-betrayal and violence. It's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home, and that's great. So that's good. And so why is that? Why? Okay, so you can start your path and you think that you're heading toward your star, and so you go in the direction, and then because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that things that glimmers in front of you is gonna have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's gonna reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it, it's almost like 180-degree reversal, but it isn't, because we've gone this far, and that's long ways to get that far, but that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshot continually, because as you overshoot, even you don't learn what you should have done, you're gonna continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point and learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this now. What I call about it tough. I think it's that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that there is nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistake. I think it was this guy setting up really advanced computational recording system in the home and recorded every single utterance this young child made while learning to speak. That's a great TED talk. And then he put together the child's attempts to say certain phonemes and put them in the list. And you can hear the child's deviation madly to begin with. And then after hundreds and hundreds of repetitions, just hearing right on the exact phonemes. So you might know this, but when kids bubble, because they start bubbling when they're quite young, they bubble every human phenomen, include all sorts of phenomenons that adults cannot say, and then they die into their language, so that after they learn, say, English, then a lot of sort of phenomenons they cannot no longer hear or pronounce. But to begin with, it's all there, which is really quite interesting. But so they learn to particular language, the zero, in a proper way to pronounce that, and their errors minimizing. And every time you learn something, that's how is it, and that's really useful to know too, because it means that it's okay to wander around stupidity before you fix your destination. Now you see that echoed in Exodus, right? Because what happens in that Egyptians and Hebrews escape a tyranny, which is a kind of whatever you do personally and psychologically when you escape from your previous set of stupidity, held and ignorant and stubborn axioms. It's like away from that tyranny. It's like, great, I freed myself from that. Well, then what? Well, you think, well, now I'm on the way. It's no, you're not. Now you're in the desert where wander around stupidly, worship the wrong thing until you finally organize yourself morally again and head in the proper direction. So that worth knowing too. Because you think, well, I got rid of things, baggage, excessive baggage that I didn't need in my life, and now everything is okay. It's like, no, it's not. You've got rid of a whole set of scaffold that were keeping you in the place, even though they were pathological. Now you have nothing, and nothing actually turns out to be better than something pathological, and you're still stuck with the problem of nothing. And that's exactly why Exodus is structured the way that it is. It is that escape from a tyranny. It's hooray, you're not longer slaves. Well, now you're nihilistic and lost. It's not necessarily an improvement, but it is the pre-see. It's also useful to know that because you can also be deluded into the idea that imagine that you're trying to become enlightened, which might mean to turn all these pairs of you, and that could be turned on. You think, well, that's just linear pathway uphill, it's just from one success to another. No, it's not. It's like here you are and you're not doing too badly, and the first step is a completable bloody catastrophe. It's worse, and then maybe you can pull yourself together and you hit and you plateau, and then that crumbles and shakes and bang, it's wrong again. And so become part of the reason that people don't become enlightened. It's because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then are basically screwed, because you go ahead and your movement forward and you collapse and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapse. It's like, no, it's a part of the course. It's not indications that you failed. It's just indication that it is really hard, and then when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearn is probably useful, and unlearning is painful, Let's say if you have to get out of the bad relationship, it's like not in real. There isn't any relationship that 100% bad. And when you jump out of it, well, maybe you are in better shape. You're still lonesome and disoriented. You don't know what your past was, and you don't know what your present is, and you don't know what your future is. That's why people stay with devil they know instead of, looking for the devil they don't know. So anyway, the fact that you're full of fault doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of fault doesn't mean you cannot learn. And so you can posit an idea and you're going to be wrong about it. But it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positioning the ideal, moving towards it. Its actual idea isn't conceptualized perfectly well. Well, first, surprise, because because like, what are you gonna do that? Perfect? So it doesn't matter that's imperfect. It's just matter you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful, okay? So like, if you were an efficient person, you would have just done that, but you're not. But who cares, you know? You still end up in the same place, and maybe the trip is even more interesting. Who knows? Probably too interesting.